What's up, Mi40 University? I am here with the professor of muscle himself, the muscle prof, Dr. Jacob Wilson at the Mi40 gym in Tampa. We're going to teach you guys a follow-up video to metabolic flexibility. And today's topic of interest is how to influence metabolic flexibility with things like training and nutrition. So Dr. Wilson is a researching extraordinaire on everything to do with hypertrophy, and he's going to tell you guys about how to manipulate nutrition and training to maximize metabolic flexibility. And for those of you that didn't watch yesterday's video, one, go back and watch it. Two, metabolic flexibility is effectively your body's ability to use nutrients at rest, or in response to dietary intake. So if I eat a high-fat meal, will my body be prone and inclined to using fat as fuel, or will it want to only use carbs as fuel and store that fat? So metabolic flexibility is your body's ability to switch from using carbs or fats as fuel dependent on what you eat. So Doc, how can we influence that? Can we influence that? And what's our best opportunity to get our body using the greatest amount of fat as fuel?
Absolutely. So the main point is we want to use, especially at rest or during exercise, we want to use a lot of fat as fuel. Mm-hmm. We don't want to be metabolically inflexible.
Right.
And so one of the things we know that affects that is something called insulin sensitivity. And basically, like, if I consume carbs, for example, your pancreas releases insulin that tells your muscle to take up and use carbs, but insulin also essentially will affect fat metabolism. So what basically happens is, like, say that I don't hear too well. What's someone going to do? They're going to talk louder. So if your muscles are insulin resistant, insulin sensitive, you'll release more insulin. Insulin sensitivity is as little as insulin as possible to get the job done. Okay, so basically, how do we increase insulin sensitivity? So we have the effect on muscle, but we don't want to increase fat, and we can use fat. Basically, we have to increase in our cell the main machinery that oxidizes or uses fat as fuel, and that's called mitochondria. So how do we increase that? Basically, we have to actually put an energy drain on the cell. We have to deplete the cell temporarily of carbohydrates, not all the time, but at least temporarily. So one of the things is, like, when you look at Ben, he went on the metabolic cart. He was using only 15% of his calories were carbs because he was fasting. It means he's metabolically flexible. Well, watch Ben train. Ben has a lot of high volume, very, very well conditioned. Even if Ben wasn't doing direct cardio, he's still going to be very conditioned. And so that means he's depleting his muscles a lot of times, and so he has a lot of mitochondria in his muscles, and so he has a lot of insulin sensitivity and therefore metabolic flexibility.
That's why dietarily, nutrient timing is very, very important. So how you set your body up to use nutrients is really important. So breakfast, for example, I'm a big advocate of a high protein, high fat breakfast, because as soon as I know from experience and from research now that as soon as I spike my insulin levels, my body's going to stop burning fat as fuel. So if I wake up in the morning and I spike my insulin, my body no longer is able to use fat as fuel as efficiently. Mm-hmm. It's going to switch to using carbohydrates. So it's going to immediately stop burning fat, start using carbohydrate. I don't want that. I want my body to start using or keep using fat as fuel as long as possible. This is why someone even like myself at my level is going to always strategically cycle nutrients. So there's always going to be strategic carbohydrate cycling, strategic fat cycling. So even someone trying to build muscle, you don't want to go on a low carbohydrate diet all the time if you're trying to build muscle, or maybe you do, maybe there's an argument for it. But for me personally, I want to have as many carbohydrates as I can and not accumulate fat. So how do I do that and still maintain metabolic flexibility so my body composition doesn't go up, or fat storage doesn't go up, and still get the amount of performance I want? And that's with strategic carbohydrate cycling. So I have days when my training volume is really high, where my carbs are really high. Or I have days where I'm not training at all, where my carbs are basically zero. So allowing your body to regain that insulin sensitivity, like Dr. Wilson was saying. And another strategic, I actually like for you to talk about this, is tell them how what you eat around the workout influences, kind of like you touched on briefly, how it's going to influence what your body's using as fuel.
100%. So basically, let's say that, we talk about, like, if you're training, particularly, we would do cardio to utilize fat, for example. Well, if you go and you're to do a cardio session and you have a bunch of muscle carbohydrate stores or glycogen stores, and you have a large bolus of carbohydrates, your body's going to think
bolus,
it's just
like
fine.
in your stomach or in your blood.
Yeah, basically like a huge burst of carbs, like say 60 carbs or whatever. Your body's going to use that preferentially and not basically use the fat that's in its muscle. And in fact, your muscle's going to go, oh, I'm fine. Why do I need to use fat? And in fact, you're giving me so many carbs. Why do I need to long-term use more fat as fuel? So it's not going to adapt. But if you go in there, say that Ben has a low-carb breakfast and he does HIIT training or interval training on a lower carb state, he'll utilize the carbs in his muscle, but now he'll drain the cell, and his cell's gonna go, whoa, I'm out of carbs. Now I gotta increase mitochondria because I have to be able to use fat as an alternative source of fuel because I'm out of carbs.
So is that then an argument for fasted cardio?
Well, I'll tell you what, it's an argument for lower carbohydrate, definitely lower carbohydrate cardio, but like you could have, for example, MCTs,
Sure.
and still would be utilizing mainly fat as fuel.
Right.
So, but it would say that if you were fasted, you would certainly be utilizing fat as fuel, and stimulating mitochondria.
So we like to talk about high intensity cardio. I'm a big advocate, you're a big advocate. Would that be most effective done in a fasted state, in a low carb state, in a high carb state? Because there's been some people suggest that you want to do high intensity cardio in a high carb state because you get greater thermogenesis long term. What's your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are for metabolic flexibility that you want to at least get some of your sessions, even if it's these half of the sessions, in a somewhat of a depleted state, because that's going to trigger the mitochondrial adaptations. It's funny because like Ben was getting ready to actually diet for the Arnold, and when he thought it, I was like, oh man, he's coming into the lab to do Wingates. I better get in Wingate shape. So, but basically, when you're doing that high intensity cardio, say at least half of the sessions, and actually there's research by Hansen that shows that she did that, where she had her lab where they did the first session they had normal carbs, but then they stayed depleted, and the next session they actually did it in a depleted phase, and they got way more mitochondria than the people always did in a high carb.
So is there an argument though that in a depleted state you may burn muscle? Because that's always everyone's concern. I'm going to burn precious muscle. Is that a concern? So personally, like I don't want to sacrifice muscle. I want to build as much muscle as possible. So I would sacrifice burning immediate fat for that long-term metabolic upregulation from high-intensity cardio. What's the argument there? Like, should I be focused on, like, I want my body to burn fat now with HIIT, or are we talking like I should be looking more long-term? I know for the day I'm going to burn more calories because I've got this metabolic upregulation from really high-intensity work.
Great question. And what I would say on that is that if you look at like our last episode of Mark Coles using like 60-65% of his calories from carbs, if he goes and does that low carbohydrate, he's more in danger of using muscle, because his body's like, I can't use fat, I'm going to convert.
Left.
Yeah. Whereas Ben actually is going to use more fat as fuel, which will spare the muscle tissue.
So it's genetically dependent.
Yeah.
Or dietarily
or
dependent.
Dietarily
right.
dependent.
So Mark takes in very, very low fat. Mark Coles was on our episode 13. Very, very low fat, very high carbohydrates. So when his carbohydrate stores are low, his body's immediately going to switch to burning muscle. Whereas with me, when my body glycogen stores are low, because I'm metabolically flexible, because my body burns more fat at rest, I may be less inclined to burn my muscle. So you look at guys who are pro bodybuilders who it seems like they do everything right to build muscle, and they just accumulate. They may be really metabolically flexible, meaning they don't burn any carbs as fuel. At rest, they burn all fat, meaning they don't ever break down any muscle tissue. So they always accumulate muscle tissue no matter what they're doing. They're accumulating. Whereas someone who's carbohydrate dependent at rest may be accumulating muscle tissue when they're eating, but when they're not eating, they're burning muscle tissue, right?
Yes.
So that's metabolic flexibility, and learning how to manipulate the diet for you based on how you respond. If you find you tend to break down a lot, or you eat a lot of carbohydrates and still are hungry, maybe that means you're burning through a lot of carbohydrates, so maybe adding in some fats may allow you to switch a little bit.
100%. That's so critical to point that out. And also, research basically shows that the leaner you get, the more in danger you are of losing muscle. So if you're not metabolically flexible and you don't have another type of source of fuel to spare that muscle, you notice that some people, right when they get below single digits, then they start losing muscle really quick. Those are the people with really high carb diets who are not metabolically flexible. That's why Ben, who manipulates his carbohydrates, manipulates his fat so his body can adapt to both, might be able to spare more muscle as he gets leaner.
Yes, ultimately you need to learn what's great for you, learn how to intelligently cycle your nutrients, learn how to intelligently plan nutrient timing throughout the day, and most effectively work really, really hard. Allow your body to maximize insulin sensitivity for you. You may have genetic predisposition to being insulin resistant, maybe you're genetically predisposed to being insulin sensitive. You need to learn to train really hard, open up those cells so they're receptive to the nutrients you're putting in as often as possible. Increasing training frequency, increasing effort is going to maximize insulin sensitivity. Ben Pakulski, Jacob Wilson, we're out.